The civil service has long been the subject of political criticism. Conservatives have branded it the Blob, accusing it of being a self-serving, socially progressive institution that obstructs any government policy it disagrees with. They argue that Whitehall is ideologically captured, frustrating ministers' will and bending policy away from what the public actually want. But is that fair, or is it just a convenient way to shift the blame when politicians can't deliver? Many of the civil servants I've met struck me as being incredibly intelligent and motivated, underpaid and stuck working in an organisation that isn't designed to succeed in the modern world. Our guest today, Calum Miller, has seen it from both sides. He was a senior civil servant helping to deliver government policy at Whitehall. As a Liberal Democrat MP, he has a different vantage point, holding government to account from the other side. So, Calum, you worked for a long time in the civil service. People have been talking about this word, the Blob. Do you have any understanding of what they actually mean by that? And is that a fair accusation?
So I think I associate the Blob with Michael Gove, not as a comment on him as an individual, but as a person who used to use that phrase an awful lot. And my understanding, having listened to him vent about this on a few occasions, is that it was conceived of as this gelatinous body of uninspiring, slow-moving, sticky bureaucracy that was, from his perspective, deeply frustrating the clear direction that ministers wished to give to the state.
Is that fair? Was it?
I think, like most of these things, there were elements that were valid. You know, the civil service does have a caution built into it. It's often said, but civil servants are much more penalised for taking risks than they are rewarded. And so that creates an inertia, which I think it's fair to say. My criticism or challenge back to ministers would always be, in the end, it's a question of leadership. And if you end up in this negative dynamic where you criticise the institution, it's never doing things right, and when it does things wrong, you hang the civil servants out publicly for criticism, it's no wonder that people are deeply cautious.
Well, I think anyone who's worked in a team with a boss that blames them for their failings will relate to that. And I've worked, quite a bit before I became elected in organisational change. And if you come in and say to everyone, you're rubbish and, no wonder this company is failing, right, it's not really inspiring of the sort of change that you want to try and get them to deliver. The civil service does a lot of the delivering of government policy, doesn't it? I mean, how would you describe it to somebody who probably hasn't been particularly familiar with its functions? Well,
the UK civil service, I'm not up to speed on today's numbers, but it's roughly 500,000 employees. The vast majority of those people are doing frontline tasks. They could be prison officers, they could be processing vehicle applications at DVLA. There's a smaller number who are involved in the work in Whitehall, made famous by the likes of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, and they're involved in supporting the government of the day in policy development and in the legislative business that government undertakes. But actually, a lot of civil servants today are people working in their communities and delivering public services.
So those people, those Whitehall civil servants, and I take your point that most of the civil servants are actually out there doing things on the ground, but the ones that are in these kind of management-y policy roles, they must be extremely influential.
So in the British system, they are the permanent government, I think it's fair to say. Many other countries in the world politicise and have political appointments to a deeper level. So in the United States, for example, down to the level of Deputy Assistant Secretary, as it's called, which is basically the first rung of what we in this country call the senior civil service, is a political appointment. And so the fact that we go right up to permanent secretary, who's the person who actually controls the money, it's not the Secretary of State, it's the permanent secretary who controls the money in a department, and that is not a political appointment, is quite striking in its separation between the political and the permanent. So in that respect, they have lots of power because civil servants are there all the time. Regardless of the changes in government, they are still the ones there, still taking forward the policy advice, still managing and running the business of departments of state.
And with the current turnover of secretaries of state, that feels necessary, but again, it might be a barrier to change. But doesn't it also carry the cost of having not just its own culture, because all organisations have a culture, but the potential for its own ideology as well? Is the ideology of the civil service something which is sort of you sensed when you were there, and do you sense it now that you're on the other side?
So I think it's fair to distinguish between what I might describe as a sense of self and a sense of purpose, and an ideology which suggests a set of beliefs. And I don't think that in my experience, that many civil servants have strong beliefs which are driving a given policy over another one. But what they do have is a very strong sense of what it means to be a civil servant and what the appropriate breadth of the activities that they should undertake should be.
Fine.
So there's a civil service code which speaks about honesty and impartiality and integrity and objectivity. Those core values are ones that most civil servants are inducted into. And that gives them a sense of propriety and proper behaviour, at least in my experience. Sometimes that rubs up against ministers because ministers want to do something faster or quicker, or they want to consult less, or they want to, take some more legal risk or take some more financial risk. And sometimes that, for civil servants, is a real tension. What I've seen much less of, which is what is often accused by some politicians, is the idea that there's a sort of core civil service set of ideological policy beliefs that, regardless in the change of government, just carries on seamlessly, and ministers, as the conceit of Yes Minister had, are just a bit of an abstract
legal necessity or something.
Exactly.
But I mean, you were working in the civil service at the height of quite an interesting period, including in the coalition. And you're saying you didn't see that ideology sort of dominating the decisions the civil service was making, but some stuff rubbed up against politicians. Is the ideology coming from politicians then, do you think? Is it coming the other way around?
Yeah, to some degree. So I've always argued that successful government departments have to be an exercise in joint leadership. I think you have some sectors of state, particularly those perhaps who are new to government, whose impression would be, I'm the boss now and I will run everything. But actually, as you've alluded to, they're not the boss necessarily for that long.
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of the, frankly, quite managerial side of the department, whether it's the money or the people or the GDPR side, that Secretary of State don't want to concern themselves, or they want to be able to hand that to somebody else and say, you're in charge of this. But that requires joint leadership with the permanent secretary, for example.
Yeah.
And what you really need, in my view, for it to be successful is a bit of mutual respect about, well, you take care of these things and I will look after these things, and a willingness on both sides to explore the strengths and experience that each bring. Because we all know some Secretaries of State have run big organisations, some Secretaries of State have run literally nothing.
Yeah, and that must be difficult, receiving that from the other side, if you've got someone coming in with maybe some subject matter expertise, maybe none. I guess I'm going to challenge a little bit deeper on this, because there are these accusations that woke mind viruses are penetrating the apparatus of the British state, or that I think somebody who's remain nameless said that we should carpet bomb the cancer of wokery. I'm not sure what that means, or that we carpet bomb cancers as a treatment method, but do you see where they're coming from? What is it that's prompted that accusation, do you think?
Well, I think there's two obvious things going on. One is that in the end, as I said, civil servants have to uphold law. And if you come after, as current governments have, a period when certain things have been hardwired into our legislative framework, things like freedom of information legislation or judicial review or other aspects of EDI and maybe environmental protection, and you're a minister who thinks that all of that is wokery, then you're angry with the civil servants because they are giving you the message that you can't do certain things. But that's because they are charged to tell you when you're about to break the law. The correct ministerial response to that is say, fine, let's dismantle all of this. But then you've got to make the political argument to do it. So that's one element I can see. I think the other element is that, civil service is a public service, and probably, I haven't seen the kind of survey data, but probably the majority of people who feel themselves motivated to take up those kinds of roles in the public service are weighing that up against other professions, all of which require a university education, all of which require a certain type of training, and may well be subject to a certain amount of groupthink. And if you enter that space, particularly in the current context from the populist right, you're likely to feel as though these are a group of people who are on a different wavelength to you, and that doubtless creates some tension.
That's interesting. So one thing that you just said, which really resonated with me, is the fact that it might be too late to throw your toys out of the pram if that's the way things are. So it's a bit like coming into a manufacturing business and trying to change the product once it's rolling off the production line. It would actually take time to redesign policy, change laws around that new agenda. That's a really sage point. But you've also mentioned groupthink. And the civil service has done a lot to try and encourage diversity. But then again, it's also been slammed for having DEI policies. Isn't it desperately in need of diversity of thought, at least? And therefore, the people calling for the abandonment of DEI policies might be sort of making their own funeral in that regard.
Yeah, well, as always, when we get into these questions, it's which type of diversity? And I think those who are attacking it because they think it's a diversity that is driven by quotas and driven by certain identifiers. What you're talking about, I think, is diversity of thought, which probably does have a bit of a dimension that relates to people's background and educational experiences and so on, but also relates to where they are on, in terms of their fundamental beliefs about the country and about what's important and so on. So I think the civil service is aware, but I think it has been slow to move.
Yeah.
But on that point, bear in mind the irony of what I'm saying, that the self-same ministers who are complaining that they're surrounded by a bunch of, London-based university-educated folk are actually demanding that they're surrounded by a bunch of London-based, often university-educated folk. So ministers have to get on board with what they're asking for if that's really what they want to see.
That's really interesting. I mean, it's another argument to move Parliament to Birmingham for the next 10 years while they refurbish the Palace of Westminster, but that's probably out of scope of this conversation. So when I was in business, we used to often talk about what the customer wants and what they need, and they weren't ever in the room. One of the privileges of being an MP is that I get to talk to a lot of people every week about what they actually think. And so I feel like I'm closer to the customer of politics than I probably was in lots of previous roles. Is it less about who's in the civil service and where they're based, and more about who they're listening to and how they distill the information that they've got about people's views and values? And also, let's face it, about how to make things work better. There's a lot of stuff we could do if public were on board that would make life a lot easier for people.
So I think I've got probably quite a particular perspective on this, which might not be a fair reflection of the civil service as a whole, because I started my career at the Treasury. But one of the characteristics of it is somewhere that thinks that it operates in quite a rationalistic, evidence-led environment. But there's a sort of a desire to be almost painfully objective, and to leave to ministers that business of, understanding what people want or imposing moral value on policy making. And I think that's problematic, because it means that advice to ministers is very technocratic.
Yeah.
So we're in a parliament where there's been plenty of criticism thrown at the Chancellor and the Treasury for coming up with duff ideas because they weren't willing to go and just really understand what that would mean, whether that's family farm taxes or whatever happens to be.
That, isn't it?
There's a really delicate balancing act between, on the one hand, getting out there and talking, as you say, to citizens, to customers, if you like, and on the other hand, becoming a rival source of information to the minister.
Yeah.
Like, I find it quite hard to imagine that dialogue where you sit down with the minister and the minister's like, I want to achieve this, and you say, that's a good idea, minister, but I was speaking to people in location X last weekend and what they were telling me. I think most ministers would go, wait a minute, that's my job.
Yeah. I'll tell you what people think.
So I think there's a real tension there, where if ministers are saying, I want, civil servants who are more grounded in the real world to get on my wavelength, we need to be careful that ministers aren't really saying, I want civil servants who think like I think.
Yeah. It does sound like a lot of this is down to ministers and how much they understand about how to operate the state, how to work with teams, which may be past experience or it may not be. But there's also clearly a lot of sort of fluidity in this, in terms of who actually forms the policy, because saying something is undeliverable or operationally challenging is very difficult for a politician to say, well, I actually went and spent 6 months studying this and I think you'll find that you're wrong. It's perfectly doable. So there's a real danger that entryism of certain ideas and ideology can really shape that agenda. There's a big thing, I know it was found not to have broken any rules, but there's a big thing with a Muslim activist network recently in the civil service that were called out for, basically having sidebar conversations about what they wanted to achieve, so almost acting as a sort of organisation within the civil service. Is that typical? Does that happen in lots of different ways? Is that just part of the way that a sort of big organisation, a big diverse organisation tends to work? Or is that indicative of some of the challenges that we've got at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's really important to draw a distinction between, if you like, the policy space, and then, if you will, the identity space that certain employees may have.
Yeah.
So we're talking here about a Muslim network. We could equally be talking about an environmental network or another grouping within the civil service, where people are coming together because they share a faith or they share an interest. And ostensibly, like any good large employer, that's the kind of thing employers try to encourage, because they want people to sort of mix with others of a similar viewpoint, feel that they're welcome. But it can create an opportunity for a different pole of thinking.
Yeah.
And I guess the critical question is, A, were things that take place in any of these organizations sort of frankly legal and acceptable?
Yeah.
But then secondly, how close were they to actually the responsibilities of the individuals involved?
Yeah.
I mean, I would feel very different about people, let's say there was a Christian network.
Yeah.
And if that group were...
Are you a Christian?
I am, as it happens. But if that group were getting together regularly to have prayer meetings and to talk about what mattered to them in society or share their own experiences and have a personal connection, but actually their policy realm was environmental protection,
buses,
and unless there was some strong thing where there was something sort of creationists or a strong perspective on the relationship between their faith and the environmental protection, I'm not sure that would be problematic as such.
Any more problematic than a darts club or a Friday social?
Correct. So I think it's important to distinguish between, if there were people who were getting together to, inappropriately develop policy and feed that into the system, that would be one thing.
Yeah.
But the kinds of issues that I believe were thrown out by this network seem to me to be ones that just relate to, whether or not behaviours of any group are acceptable in what the impact they have on other members of that organisation.
So part of this is about confronting the myth that people don't have their own beliefs, right? I mean, surely nobody who's smart enough to work for the civil service is devoid of their own personal opinions and beliefs. All of us must do, and I'm sure we don't agree on everything in terms of our core values. So do we need to just basically deal with that, recognise it, allow people the freedom to express those beliefs, but expect them still to act according to their requirements of their jobs? Is that a feasible thing?
That's where I would come from.
Right.
And even in my decade or more in the civil service, I think I saw a shift in expectations around that. So I think the organisation I joined, as I said, very much inducted in the civil service code. And there were definitely times when I find myself almost wondering if I'd forgotten what I believed in.
Yeah.
I was sufficiently well trained, you might say brainwashed, to be objective all the time, to go looking for the evidence, to listen to what the minister wanted and try to provide answers to their questions, rather than myself to have any kind of policy or moral prior. And that, I think I was, in a sense, being a good civil servant, but I was losing, genuinely, as a personal level, losing a bit of self in all of that. And what I saw was a new generation of civil servants coming in, where a sense of purpose, a sense of values, a sense of why do I get up in the morning and go and do this job was increasingly important to their identity.
Yeah.
And I think undoubtedly that then starts to create more tension. So the more you mobilize and motivate people with this call to be doing something that matters, the more they're going to want to hold on to what it is that matters to them. And that it potentially creates a tension with the objectivity and partiality side.
Well, I believe optimistically that people change their minds and have fluid beliefs, but it does reach some challenges when you have certain cultural behaviours or attitudes where actually it's not just about your own belief, it's about your application of a very clear set of codified rules. Is that still sustainable, do you think?
I think it has to be. I mean, I'm not sure if we're going to have a structure with a separation between the ministers of the political leadership and the civil services, if you like, the advisory and delivery mechanism, we have to leave the ministers accountable for setting the kind of the direction, the policy intent, and if you like, the moral framework for that party and that government's ambition.
Yeah.
And to then have civil servants who are butting up against that and saying not, do you know what, Minister, I know your objective is to reduce child poverty, but I think we've got a better way of doing it. But actually, do you know what, Minister, child poverty is not nearly as important as this aspect of international development or this development of climate change, and therefore we're going to frustrate your ambitions here because we think something else is more morally important.
Yeah.
That's when you get into the realm of a lack of democratic accountability.
And I think that's perhaps where the fear recently has come from, or the accusations. Is not so much observing the inner workings of the civil service as it's observing that there appears to be a disconnect between what people think they voted for and what then happens. It sounds like you've now been both sides of that fence. A lot of the responsibility lies with policymakers to actually have a vision and a plan and a set of policies that achieve what people voted them in for.
My view is that you need ministers who are, if you like, bold enough to set out their vision and where they want to get to, and brave enough to let go of some of that control and allow the civil service to take it away and think about how to deliver it and bring them back options.
Yeah.
And I think partly due to the sort of velocity of media, which requires the minister to have a plan almost before they're through the door.
Yeah.
But also due to the difficult business of building trust, and also having a lot of ministers who have had no experience of government before, we get into this negative dynamic that I was alluding to of a kind of command and control instinct on the part of ministers, which almost denudes the civil service of some of the added value they can offer.
Yeah. Because
the civil service is not saying that we know how the state works, we know what the levers are, and we could advise you on how to achieve this objective. If ministers come in and say, well, our manifesto was not only costed, but had all the implementation nailed down, so will you stop telling me what to do? Here's how to do it. Yeah. And actually, Michael Gove was wont to do that. I mean, not a man who, suffers his own modesty too much. He definitely came in and said, we have a plan. I don't need your advice on it. I just need you to implement.
So he came at the end of the production line saying, I want all these blue cars painted yellow, basically.
Pretty much.
Bit late to say that sort of thing at that point in time. You're watching Politics Unchained with me, Steff Aquarone, and my guest, Calum Miller. We're talking about the Blob and whether it's a fair accusation of the way in which the civil servant operates in Britain today. We may agree, we may disagree, but we need to have the conversation. And if you're interested in what we're talking about, don't forget to subscribe to catch up with what we do next. What about it as an apparatus overall? So I've spent quite a long time working with organisations that are trying to completely rewire the way they work, because the world's changed and they care now about how the customer is doing, what their experience is. They're trying to design themselves around the customer experience more so than perhaps the product. Now, the civil service is a factory for policy. It's a product-making organisation that delivers on policy objectives. So is it structured in the right way for the modern world, do you think, with all these departmental silos, or is there work to be done there?
Like all organisational design, you could definitely make it better. I think the two things I would really pull out are, one, that Whitehall tends to behave as though its job is to serve up the service, the output, and then it's the job of the citizen to consume it. So there is definitely something when it comes to the front line of government services that needs radical overhauling. We've seen some initiatives in that direction, Government Digital Service and some others, try to sort of take the system and reshape it in a way that would be led by the needs of the customer or the citizen.
Yeah.
What has never happened is that the underpinnings behind that in Whitehall, if you like, have ever been broken down to reflect that.
Right.
And occasionally we have what Whitehall watchers call machinery of government changes, which normally just means the changing of a name plaque outside a building. But ministers like to trumpet into being the thing that will allow us to focus on innovation or focus on climate or whatever it happens to be. But realistically, we still have these departments.
And do you think that the civil service is capable of working more cross-functionally in what some people might say is an agile way? Now, I'm not sure what that word means, but I think it means doing things quite quickly and sort of having very short-term project plans so you can get things done and see if they work.
Yes, but the civil service is constrained by law, finance, and political will. Yeah. And all of those are quite significant constraints. Yeah. And ministers, on the one hand, would like to see much more rapid delivery, much more agility. They'd like their voters and citizens to be much happier more of the time. But to do that requires them to release a bit of grip as well. And sometimes what you find is that what appears to be a disagreement between some frontline services, let's say on, the public health grant between local government on the one hand and a local health trust on the other, is actually, when you follow the money, really about a spat between the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government and the Secretary of State for Health.
So this is people who can't get out of hospital because there aren't enough nursing homes. No one in the hospital wants to pay for more nursing homes because it's their Secretary of State's got the health budget and someone else's has got the local council budget. It's that fundamental.
It's that fundamental.
There needs to be some rewiring, doesn't there? But but I saw it work in big business. It was when you had a not too dissimilar number of different stakeholders needing to agree the same overall vision. You had shareholders and the board and the chief exec and senior management, and then all those other people that actually need to change what they're doing. So it does need all that to line up. And it feels like the chances of that happening at the moment in British politics seem fairly slim. But is there an appetite, do you think, for change?
I think there is. Look, different things have been experimented with. So one thing that has been experimented with are what called pooled budgets. So you, instead of having the money sitting in health and sitting in local government, you actually force that money to be put together, and that means people have to get around the table and agree on how it's going to be spent. So there has been experimentation, but my point remains, which is that ministers at the top need to be willing actually to give up some power and to give up some money to allow for this, fusing of different resources to happen. And it's very tempting to blame that on kind of sticky civil servants as if they're fighting the turf. My experience is most civil servants move between departments. They work with colleagues from other departments. They're more willing to collaborate and cooperate, but they are aware of the holders of political power and authority in their departments, and they can't move without those folk saying, we're going to do this together.
It's part of the problem that politicians are in awe of tech bros who like to slash and burn, or get to build it all from scratch. Quite often in fast growing startups, there's no sort of incumbency to deal with, and they just think that's the way to do it. Just trash everyone, burn everything down and rebuild it. That seems to have been part of what motivated the go Blob comment, but it certainly seems to be alive and kicking in some of the Western politics at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the challenge in all of that is what it takes to reconstruct. The trouble with government is a lot of the services are universal.
Yeah.
So you don't have this space fix, but you can't really afford to get it that wrong. And because we have a robust, lively media environment in the United Kingdom, ministers are very accountable.
Yeah.
And therefore, when things go wrong, they feel it very personally. And that then contributes to this sort of risk aversion. So on the one hand, yes, let's do this, let's be agile, let's make this change happen. But actually the risks associated with change, which you can tolerate arguably in a commercial environment, as long as your core business is trundling along, is sometimes greater than an individual minister is willing to tolerate.
You talked about risk earlier on. So civil service, very exposed to risk. No one wants to be the person that changes something and breaks it. Pretty down kicked sometimes by recent politicians wanting to find somebody to blame for things not working. Sort of famously quite poorly paid as well. Like, why do people work in the civil service, and what does it need to do to attract, the right people, the talented people, the smart people, but also the people that are going to bring diversity of thought?
I think the civil service is much akin to any other large organisation. It recruits people because they believe in the value of the job. They are reasonably rewarded. And they think that the job they might be asked to do is stimulating, interesting, and something that they wish to be part of. Yeah. Where that goes wrong is when people become stuck in those roles and are not given the same opportunity to develop. What we need to get right are, frankly, the delegation of sufficient authority to civil servants who might be a project lead or responsible for a particular strand of policy, that they really feel that they have been entrusted by a minister to take something forward. And then that will remain stimulating and interesting, and they will feel personally accountable for it. And most of my civil service colleagues were truly dedicated public servants who went into it because they saw an opportunity to contribute, and that was what was principally motivating.
That's really striking. So the advice to the secretaries of state is set the direction, set the vision, perhaps set the guardrails, but allow the freedom and the responsibility to execute within that. Yeah. I think that would resonate with a lot of people who've led commercial organisations and teams as well. You can't spend your whole time telling people what to do or threatening them if they get it wrong. You aren't a Secretary of State, but you are an MP, so you have crossed sides. Yeah. What's there been any sort of aha moments for you, having gone from, I don't know which one's which, poacher to gamekeeper, or gamekeeper to poacher, perhaps?
Look, I mean, my personal journey, I was a school governor for a long time, having come out of being in Whitehall, and I saw too often the consequences of what I felt were kind of blanket Whitehall diktats coming down to me as a school governor. Yeah. So I've come to politics, if you like, having been in the centre of government, then being involved in community work, sort of back from the bottom up. And so therefore some things don't surprise me at all. And I've been struck in this Parliament by some of the ways in which it feels as though the Treasury has been wagging departmental bodies, the Treasury tail has been wagging them, in the sense that it doesn't feel as though the Treasury has really asked the experts, how will this policy land? Yeah. And that's done real damage.
And so we will never know whether that was a minister who forced something through that they thought was right, or a civil service that didn't object to the practical implications that they foresaw, or that nobody foresaw. And perhaps the takeaway is that everybody in government needs to spend more time understanding the communities that their policies are affecting. Yeah. And there must be a huge opportunity for that, because we've got a workforce generationally that's coming up into the ranks who have only known a world that's digitally connected, very well designed around the user experience, Is that a reason to be optimistic if we get those people into the civil service, that they will naturally be predisposed to designing things around the end user of their service or whatever it is they're doing?
I believe there's a huge opportunity for the civil service. And actually, we talk about the civil service, tend to think about national government, but actually an integration between the civil service in that sense and local government officers as well, all taxpayer funded, all with the purpose of delivering public services. And the more that they can find efficient ways to work together, starting from the perspective of what would be best for our citizen, I think there's some really promising opportunities. As a county councillor, I bang my head against the wall in a two-tier county, having some services provided by a county and some by a district, not all being housed in the same space.
Even bins, one council opens them and the other council tips them out, sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And from a citizen perspective, I don't think I ever found a citizen who could fully explain to me what the separation was or who cared.
Yeah.
And why should they?
Yeah.
And so there's huge opportunity, but it requires these bodies, these civil servants and the administration of these different entities to come together and say, how can we make this better? How can we make this experience better for the citizen? And look, in the most optimistic version, that would go a long way to addressing some people's deep frustration with the sense of a state that doesn't see them, doesn't hear them, and doesn't deliver for their needs.
I think what you've just said is that if stuff worked better, people would have less reason to complain about it and perhaps suspect that it was being done for the wrong motivations. That's to do with trust as well, isn't it? And parking aside trust in politicians, because that's an easy rabbit hole for us to go down. What about trust in the civil service? What does the civil service need to do to re-establish trust with the public?
I think the role of the civil service is caught up with the role of ministers. And it's always been a challenge for the civil service to think about itself independently of that. There was a time in the middle of the height of the Brexit referendum when there were those on the Liberal side who were arguing that the civil service was somehow failing in its duty by not standing up to ministers. And I have to say, although I was politically on that side of the debate, I wholeheartedly agreed with the view that in the end, civil servants only have an identity that is given to them by the ministers of the day. So one of the challenges of civil service is how to be trusted almost independently of the level of trust in politicians, because ultimately civil servants serve those politicians.
Yeah.
Now, the way I think you can square that circle is by civil servants, especially those involved in the delivery end of the civil service, having a direct voice with the citizen. And that requires a bit of ministerial authority. The ministers need to be comfortable for civil servants to go out and have those conversations. But if you can have the Whitehall civil servant who's responsible for expanding the prison estate actually going out and talking to communities where a prison is supposed to be expanded and hearing their views and explaining the rationale and giving them confidence. But sometimes I think the Whitehall civil service can become very detached from that. And perhaps it should be more challenged by ministers with the question, how's this policy landing? Yeah,
because we find out whether it's working way faster than we used to do. You get your first sort of bit of feedback the first time someone posts on social media that this thing is broken or not working, or the bins haven't been emptied, or they've lost access to their benefits, or whatever it is that shouldn't have happened.
And the best consumer-facing organisations are the ones that are almost hungry for criticism.
Yeah.
The ones who say, thank you so much for this stinging critique.
Yeah.
It's actually going to help us make our service or our product better. And gosh, we're a long way from that in the delivery of public services, aren't we? Any kind of stinging critique you run a mile from, or you try and close down, or the instinct of government is to try to defend itself rather than saying, thank you. We wanted to give this a go. We realised we haven't got it quite right. So would you actually like to work with us? Based on your experience, tell us how we could get it better next time.
That is quite a big culture shift.
Really?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest culture shift we've sort of discussed so far, is not going out to try and cause problems, but to recognise that complaints are information and insight, and that real-time feedback is a huge opportunity to course correct things once they've started, if they're not having the impact that you'd hoped.
But if there's been a theme of our conversation, I think it's probably been this synergy between the ministers on the one hand and the civil service on the other.
Yeah.
So if we want a civil service that is delivering in an agile way, that is responsive to the citizens' feedback, that doesn't think it's going to get it right first time, we also need a political class who are tolerant of the mistakes that will be made and actually see those as ways of strengthening the service.
Yeah.
As we know as opposition MPs, if something goes wrong in government, we'll ask a pretty tough question, or we'll encourage a journalist to look further at it. So how do we get to a, if you like, political and policy culture that is tolerant of experimentation within reasonable bounds and tolerates the fact that sometimes things aren't going to work, and where the test question is, how did you respond to that?
Yeah.
Not how did that happen in the first place?
So what happens if we get a reform government?
I think a reform government will be a challenge for the civil service. I'm sure that the senior mandarins now thinking it through and considering how they will set the right culture and the right tone. But, we saw after the outcome of the Brexit referendum that it was widely reported and definitely believed by ministers who supported the UK leaving the EU that the majority of civil servants were of the opposite opinion. And I would be very, much of the expectation that reform ministers coming in would expect that the civil service would not as a whole be sympathetic to their political viewpoint. So that's a huge trust challenge for the civil service. Can they spin around and say, look, we are here to serve the democratically elected party of the day, and therefore we're here to serve you? And where the rubber would hit the road, in my expectation, is, similar space to where the rubber's hitting the road just now in certain councils up and down the country, where existing policies, even existing staff teams, which have been there for some time, which have been contributing, if you like, not only on the policy side, but on the cultural side of the organisation, are being disbanded because reform regards them as contrary to their policy and contrary to the mandate they have to implement things. So certainly be bumpy. In the end, some of us might not like the outcome of an election. We might indeed fight very hard to get an alternative outcome. But if we're going to be democratic and we're going to accept the electoral rules we have them now, even if we think they could be improved, we've also got to live with the result. And I think in the end, the civil service is duty bound to serve the government of the day. And so the idea that the civil service can or even should be a brake on a democratically elected government is problematic.
Yeah.
Where the civil service definitely has a role to play is to give frank and fearless advice to any new government on what the risks are that they might be taking. But actually to constructively try to block the intention of the democratically elected government is deeply problematic.
Yeah, I think it is. But we've had great examples of not destructive or creative destruction in the past, but some famous tech examples of people coming in and saying, we've got to completely change. This is how it's going to be going forward. We do need some of that, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd prefer it wasn't reform personally, but we do need some shake-up, don't we?
So, if you're inviting me to give you my utopian model of how civil service could be shaken up, I'm not convinced we need 500,000 people working in civil service. I think we need the right number of folk on the front line to deliver services. That number may well change with AI. But when it comes to the centre of government, I would rather see high quality, highly motivated people paid a little bit more, but fewer of them, so that the overall cost to the state and the taxpayer was lower.
Yeah.
And much less time spent on double checking and risk management and frankly worrying about whether or not ministers are going to be quite okay with something, and much clearer, even if challenging, direction set by ministers to allow the civil service then to think about how to implement the instruction or the intent of ministers.
And that's really optimistic and a great point to wrap up on, really, Calum, because you've kind of tapped into, I think, a broad frustration, not just amongst reform voters, but amongst lots of people, that stuff isn't working. And sounds like you don't think that's the fault of the woke ideology mind virus of the civil service or the blob, as we started talking about, but of the way things are. Things need to change. There's clearly a really important emphasis placed on the relationship between senior civil service and ministers, but also some changes perhaps within it to create a bit more risk, a bit more ownership, a bit more motivation for the people that work there.
And one thing I'd like to finish with is to say that the civil service has in the past been described as a Rolls-Royce organisation. It was the envy of some other administrations. And there are still values at the heart, I believe, of the civil service that are still just as laudable. We are very lucky to have a civil service that doesn't have the types of corruption and self-interest that is evident in some other bureaucracies around the world. What we are lacking right now is a civil service that has the dynamism to deliver as quickly as the public are expecting.
Yeah.
And I think the civil service needs to own its part in the responsibility for that. But politicians should not simply say, well, there's a distinction between us and our clarity of thought and our vision for the country and this inept blob, which is failing to deliver. It will only work if there's a successful partnership between ministers and the civil service, both intent on responding to the frustration of the country that we're not seeing the quality of delivery that people want.
And thank you so much for coming and being so candid with your experiences on Politics Unchained. Many thanks indeed. Thank you so much, sir. Cheers. I've certainly been convinced by Calum's testimony that the civil service isn't some sort of woke, self-serving organisation that's been infiltrated by ideology. The big question, though, is about trust. Can we trust not just the politicians, but the civil servants to get the job done?